Hello, fellow night wanderer. Before we journey into the past, I want to quietly welcome you, wherever and whenever you found this moment. Whether it's morning, afternoon, or deep into the night, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always a joy to see how far this gentle circle reaches. If slow, thoughtful stories through history speak to you, feel free to subscribe so you never miss our next soft step through time. Now, get comfortable. Breathe deeply. Let me guide you into a world far from our own. Tonight, we visit medieval Europe, not through kings or warriors, but through the often overlooked lives of women. Close your eyes if you like. Let the present slip away. And let's begin. Girls in the Middle Ages. Birth and expectations. It begins quietly. A girl is born in a village surrounded by fields, forests, and fog. There is no fanfare. No feast. No name passed down from legend. Only a midwife, a tired mother, and a father who had quietly hoped for a son. In medieval Europe, the birth of a daughter was not cause for celebration. She would not inherit land. She would not carry the family name forward. She would most likely leave one day, married off, traded in alliance or convenience. And so, her arrival was met with quiet acceptance and silent expectations. From the moment she took her first breath, her path was already narrowing. As a child, she had little time to play. Before her legs had fully grown, they were asked to carry buckets. Before her hands could write, they were taught to spin, to sweep, to serve. If she had siblings, the boys would be favored for schooling, if there was any. She would stay by her mother's side, learning how to care for a house that would never be her own. By the age of 7, she knew her role. By 12, she may have already been promised to a man she had never met, and by 14, she could be a wife, sometimes even a mother. The expectations were simple: obedience, silence, endurance. A good daughter was quiet, modest, and helpful. She would kneel before priests, elders, and husbands. She would bow her head in church and at the table. She would not speak out of turn, and she would never speak against a man. But even in this rigid world, girls found moments beside a hearth fire, listening to stories, moments in fields beneath open skies, where for a few minutes they could just be, not free, but still human. And that mattered, even if history rarely noticed. Upbringing and roles. From child to bride, she was not raised for independence. She was raised to belong. In a world ruled by the church, the seasons, and men, a girl's education was not designed to open doors. It was designed to keep her in place. From the moment she could walk without stumbling, she began to learn what her future would require: silence, obedience, and usefulness. There were no schools for most girls. A handful of noble daughters might receive lessons in reading and religion from a governess or priest, but even they were trained not for intellect, but for piety, for courtesy, and for marriage. For the vast majority, peasant girls, merchant daughters, servant children, life was education. Every day taught her something new about submission, repetition, and patience. There were no classrooms, only kitchens and fields where women taught girls and girls learned quietly. She watched her mother grind flour with worn hands. She saw how her older sisters moved through rooms as if invisible. She heard the sharp tone her father used when anyone spoke too boldly, and she learned to be noticed was to be in danger. To be quiet was to be safe. By 5, she could sweep a floor. By 7, she could knead dough, carry water, and stitch basic seams. By 10, she was expected to take care of younger siblings, manage the hearth, and run small errands alone. There was no celebration for mastering these things. It was simply survival and preparation. From morning until night, girls were absorbed into the rhythms of the household. They rose before the sun, fetching wood or water before most others were awake. They helped tend animals, sort herbs, collect eggs, rinse laundry in cold rivers, and all the while, they were watched by mothers, aunts, neighbors, priests, all judging whether the girl was shaping into a suitable woman. A girl who laughed too loudly might be scolded. A girl who wandered too far might be punished. A girl who failed to lower her eyes in front of a man might be labeled immodest. And for a girl, modesty was everything. Because sooner than she could truly understand, she would be of age. In some villages, this meant 12, in others, 14. The age didn't matter so much as the body. If she had begun to bleed, she could bear children, and if she could bear children, she could be wed. Marriage was not about romance. It was an arrangement, a transaction, a passage of ownership from father to husband. Some fathers received a bride price, money, or livestock in exchange for their daughter. Others paid a dowry, gifts, and land to sweeten the deal. Either way, the girl had no say. She might meet her future husband once before the wedding. Sometimes not at all. He might be twice her age. He might already have children. He might treat her kindly, or he might treat her cruelly. There were no guarantees. And so, even in childhood, a girl was trained to please, to smile without joy, to serve without question. She learned how to cook the foods her husband might prefer. She practiced prayers to ask for patience and humility. She observed how married women endured and took mental notes. Sometimes she imagined what her wedding might be like, not in a hopeful way, not like the tales of princesses and knights, but with a quiet dread, a sense that one day the life she knew, simple though it was, would vanish, and something harder would take its place. But she dared not complain. Complaints were considered ungrateful. After all, she was lucky to have a roof, lucky not to be orphaned, lucky perhaps to be chosen at all. Some girls envied the nuns, the ones who disappeared behind stone walls, who read scriptures and wore the same robes every day. At least they were safe. At least they were left alone. Others longed for escape, though they could not name it. A longing that stirred when birds took flight. or when traders passed through town speaking strange, distant languages, or when a storm rolled in and the wind made the house groan like it had secrets. But such dreams did not last long. There was always more work to do. There was always someone watching. So she pressed on, brushing her hair until it shone, like her mother taught her, folding linens precisely, like her aunt demanded, praying not for freedom, but for acceptance, because even hope had to be tamed. And when the time came, she would step into marriage as she had stepped into everything else, quietly, carefully, without protest. Not because she wanted it, but because she had been raised for it. Child marriage and family bargains. She did not fall in love. She was assigned. In medieval Europe, marriage was not the culmination of romance. It was a transaction, a family strategy, a contract agreed upon by fathers, signed in livestock, land, or coin. For girls, it began early, far earlier than the heart was ready. In some villages, girls were promised before they could form full sentences. At the age of 6 or 7, a father might already be in talks with a neighbor, a distant cousin, a merchant in need of connections. It wasn't strange. It wasn't shocking. It was how the world worked. By 12, a girl could be married. By 13, she could be carrying a child. By 14, she might already have buried one. The church had opinions about these things, of course, but they were flexible. Technically, canon law stated that girls could be wed at 12 and boys at 14, but the enforcement of that rule depended on the region, the wealth of the family, and the will of the community. In truth, many girls were wed earlier. Sometimes the wedding was ceremonial. Sometimes it was consummated immediately. Either way, the girl was no longer a child in the eyes of the world. She might still hold a doll in one hand and wear a wedding ring on the other. She did not get to choose. A girl's opinion was not part of the process. A father might ask her to stand quietly in the room as the men spoke. She would lower her eyes and say nothing. What could she say? Her value was not in her voice, but in her virginity, in her fertility, her modesty, her ability to carry the name of another man's family. And the families had reasons. Always there were reasons. A poor family might need the bride price to survive another winter. A rich family might need the alliance to expand their land. A merchant might use marriage to tie his name to nobility. A nobleman might marry a girl simply to ensure heirs, regardless of her age or will. These were family bargains, not just in the economic sense, but in the emotional one. A girl might be told it was an honor, that she should be grateful, that many girls her age had no suitors at all, that obedience was godly, that to resist was shameful. And so she obeyed. She wore the dress her mother prepared for her, sometimes white, sometimes blue, sometimes red, but always heavy, always layered with meaning. The wedding ceremony might be brief. A priest might speak a few words in Latin. Her hand would be placed in his. Rings would be exchanged. Bread would be broken. And then it would be done. The feast might follow. If the family could afford it, there might be music. There might be laughter. But none of it would come from her. Not truly. She would sit quietly, her head covered, her eyes lowered. A child, pretending to be a woman, a girl in a role written long before she was born. Her husband might be young, or he might be 50. He might smell of wine and salt pork, or he might be silent, watching her as if she were a tool he had just purchased and was now evaluating. She did not know what would happen on the wedding night. No one told her. No one asked. Her mother might whisper a few vague warnings about duty, about pain, about bearing it well. But for many girls, the wedding night was a crossing into unknown territory, often painful, sometimes violent, and always irreversible. There was no going back. In the morning, the bed linens might be examined for blood, a public sign of a private act. A girl's body was evidence. If there was no blood, whispers would begin, rumors, accusations, perhaps punishments. And even if there was blood, she would still be changed. Her childhood would not return. No more games. No more wandering through fields. Now, she would be watched as a wife. Soon, perhaps, as a mother. She might be expected to manage a household before she understood what managing meant. She would rise early and prepare food for a man she barely knew. She would sweep, sew, scrub, and sit in church as if none of it had unsettled her, as if she had always been grown. Some girls survived this transition quietly. They adapted. They endured. They found small pieces of comfort, a warm corner in the house, a friendly servant, a neighbor who smiled. Others broke slowly, invisibly. There were no words for what they felt. There was no space to speak of fear, confusion, or grief. To be a wife was considered a blessing, even if that blessing came in the shape of chains. In noble houses, the rules were more elaborate. Girls might be sent away to live with their future husband's family years before the wedding. There, they would be trained in noble customs, embroidery, dance, posture, prayer. They would be watched constantly. Every word and movement was part of their training. In lower households, things were simpler and often harsher. A girl might be married one week and expected to carry firewood the next. There was no pause, no honeymoon, no adjustment period. She would simply be married, and everything that came with it was now hers to carry. Some husbands were kind, some were not. Some viewed their young wives as property, others as burdens, very few as equals. If a girl displeased her husband, she could be beaten. The law allowed it. So long as the stick was not thicker than his thumb, it was considered discipline, not abuse. If she disobeyed, he could lock her away. If she failed to bear children, he could shame her publicly, and if she died in childbirth, as many did, she would be replaced. But sometimes, a girl found a way to carve a space of her own. In the quiet moments, in gardens, in stories told to her own children, in letters never sent, in prayers whispered not to saints, but to herself. Not freedom, but something. She learned to survive, not because she was weak, but because she had no other choice. Her life was not hers, but her endurance was. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what made it brutal. Not just the pain, not just the silence, but the way it was accepted, expected, normal. To be a bride before becoming a woman. To be a wife before knowing her own name. To carry a family bargain on her back without understanding what she was trading. This was not rare. This was not unusual. This was life for too many. And in the stillness of that life, behind stone walls and candlelight, she grew older, quietly, compliantly, bravely, the first night. Fear, duty, and quiet grief. She did not understand what was expected of her, not truly. The dress had been stiff and unfamiliar, the ceremony quiet, the feast loud but distant. And now, the sun had gone down. The songs had faded. The candles burned low. And she was alone with him, her husband, a stranger, though she knew his name. She had not spoken more than a few words to him. She had not dared. He entered the room with a steady step, as if he had done this many times before. Perhaps he had. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the smell of flowers from earlier, but now those flowers seemed far away. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her head was lowered. She did not look up. She had been told to obey, to be still, to be pleasing. What that meant, no one had fully explained. Not her mother, not her aunts, not the older women who had prepared her. They had hinted, yes. They had spoken of duty, of becoming a wife, of the need to bear children. But they had left out the pain. They had left out the fear. They had left out the feeling of being utterly alone. The bed was wide, but it felt like a trap. The room was warm, but her skin was cold. Her breath came in shallow waves, her heart beat against her ribs like a warning drum. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. This was her place now. This was her life. He did not ask her if she was ready. That was not a question men asked their wives. Readiness was assumed. Consent was not a concept. A wife belonged to her husband. Her body, her time, her voice, all of it was his. That was what the church said. That was what custom demanded. That was what she had been taught. He approached. She did not move. When he touched her, she flinched, but she did not resist. Resisting would not have changed anything. It would only have made things worse. He touched her face, her arm, her hair. He undid the ties at her back. She stayed quiet. She stayed still. She tried not to cry. Crying, she had been told, was ungrateful. There was no affection in what followed. No care. No words of comfort. It was over quickly, and yet somehow it lasted forever. Time lost meaning. Her thoughts left her body. She watched the beams of the ceiling. She counted the cracks in the plaster. She listened to the sound of wind outside. She wondered if anyone else felt this way. She wondered if her mother had felt this way. She wondered if this would happen every night for the rest of her life. When it was done, he turned over and slept. She stayed awake. Her body ached. Her chest felt hollow. Her hands trembled. Her skin felt no longer hers. The silence was deafening. Her heart had nothing to say. The next morning, she was expected to smile, to rise early, to serve bread and water, to sweep the floor, to greet his family, or his servants, or his neighbors. No one asked her how she had slept. No one asked her how she felt. If there had been blood on the sheets, it would have been shown. Proof of virtue. If not, There would be questions, doubts. But she had bled. It had hurt. She had bitten her lip to keep from crying out. She moved slowly through the day. Every step reminded her of what had happened. Every glance felt like a judgment. Her body still remembered. Her heart tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. The night had left a mark. Not one that could be seen. Not one that would fade. There were many girls like her. Across villages and towns, cities and manors, girls were led to strange beds by the weight of tradition. Some were 12. Some were 15. Some were barely older than children, still playing with cloth dolls. And yet they were called women. Wives. Mothers in training. They were told to be grateful. Told that this was the path of every woman. Told that their feelings were less important than their function. And so they silenced themselves. They smiled when expected. They nodded. They worked. They endured. Some grew numb. Some grew angry, though they kept it hidden. Others found strength in small things, in singing softly while they worked, in moments of stillness, in the gentle presence of other women who understood. The first night was not just a physical experience. It was a transformation, a crossing. One world closed, another opened, one with rules and risks she could not control. She was no longer seen as a girl. She was now a vessel, a bearer of children, a keeper of the house, a reflection of her husband's name. And if she resisted this role, even silently, she was considered disobedient. If she cried, she was scolded. If she showed fear, she was reminded of her duty. If she said no, she was corrected. And if she refused, she could be punished. That was her reality. Some husbands were gentler than others. Some spoke kindly. Some waited. Some tried to offer comfort, but many did not. Many saw no need. Many believed it was their right, no more controversial than taking bread from their own table. And for most women, there was no protection, no law to turn to, no one to confide in. The church offered prayers, not help. A wife was expected to submit. The marriage bed was considered sacred. Her pain was considered irrelevant. And so the first night passed, and the second, and the third. Some girls counted the days. Others stopped counting. Some closed their eyes and left their thoughts behind. Others clung to a memory of childhood, something pure, something untouched. A sister's laugh, the smell of bread in a warm kitchen, the feel of sun on bare feet. But those memories grew distant, faded. She had crossed into another world, and in that world, she was expected to carry herself with grace, to speak only when spoken to bear children, to serve meals, to kneel in prayer, to keep secrets. If she was lucky, her husband would be absent often, traveling, working, fighting. She would have time to be alone, time to find pieces of herself. If she was unlucky, he would stay, watching, demanding, claiming. And yet, she lived, she endured. She learned how to move through this life with care, how to find safety in stillness, how to shape her days around quiet acts of resistance. A slow walk in the garden, a whispered story to a neighbor, A silent moment at dusk, eyes closed, remembering who she once was. The first night never truly left her. It lingered in the back of her mind, in the ache of her back, in the quiet of her prayers, in the way she looked at her own daughters one day and wondered if they too would be led into silence. And when her daughter asked her someday what it meant to be a wife, she would pause. She would not speak of pain. She would not speak of fear. But she might hold her daughter a little longer that night. She might hum an old lullaby. She might light a candle and let it burn longer than usual. Because that was what she had. Small moments, soft resistance, and the strength to survive what she could not escape. Marriage as contract, love not required. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a matter of the heart. It was not built on affection, nor shaped by shared dreams or quiet walks beneath the moon. It was business. It was survival. It was law. For a medieval woman, marriage was not the beginning of a romantic journey. It was a formal transfer of responsibility, of labor, of body. It was a contract, sealed not with kisses, but with property, livestock, and signatures from men. When a girl was married, her identity shifted in the eyes of her community. She was no longer her father's daughter. She became her husband's wife. She changed households, changed loyalties, and often changed names. She did not sign her marriage agreement. Someone else did that for her, but it was binding all the same. Love was not expected. In many cases, it was discouraged. Love complicated things. Love inspired rebellion, distraction, risk. What mattered was status, fertility, and obedience. A wife was expected to work hard, bear children, and serve her husband's household with quiet diligence. If love grew over time, that was acceptable. But if it never appeared at all, no one would question the marriage. It was still valid. It still served its purpose. The legal structure of marriage placed women firmly beneath their husbands. A married woman in most European regions could not own property independently. She could not represent herself in court. She could not make large decisions about her home, her children, or her future without male approval. Her legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. In the eyes of the law, they were not two people. They were one. And he was that one. Marriage came with duties. A woman was expected to provide companionship, manage the household, and, above all, produce heirs. A man, in turn, was expected to provide protection and material support. But the balance of power was deeply uneven. If he failed to protect her, there were few consequences. If she failed to obey, she could face punishment. And if she failed to bear children, her value in the household could quickly diminish. For noble families, marriage was political. Alliances between houses were everything. A well-arranged marriage could mean the gain of land, titles, influence, or wealth. In such cases, the bride might travel far from her home to a region where she knew no one, where the language or customs were different, where she would be a foreigner in her own life. But it did not matter. She was sent because it was useful, because it benefited someone else. Among merchants, marriage helped expand business. Joining families meant combining wealth, securing trade routes, increasing influence in city councils or guilds. A daughter was an asset, not only for domestic labor, but as a link between two business names. She might marry a man twice her age if it meant greater profits. She might never see her family again. In peasant villages, marriage was survival. Land was often scarce, and inheritance complex. A marriage might secure a working partnership, combining two sets of hands for planting, harvesting, and raising livestock. But even here, the woman's position was secondary. Her work was essential, but her rights were limited. Her value was not in who she was, but in what she could provide. There was little room for refusal. A girl who resisted marriage risked being labeled disobedient, even sinful. The church preached the virtue of marriage and the dangers of independence. It warned against lust, but required women to submit to their husbands. A wife had no right to withhold her body, no matter how she felt. Marital consent was given once, at the altar, and never again. What followed was considered obligation, not choice. In rare cases, women entered marriage willingly. Some knew their husbands beforehand, had spoken with them, even laughed with them during shared chores or markets. Sometimes, friendship softened the transition, but even then, the love was secondary. The marriage existed with or without it. The household itself was a place of hierarchy. The husband was master. The wife managed the inner workings, food, servants if there were any, the care of children, the maintenance of tools and supplies. She did not rule, but she maintained. Her days were full of labor. From dawn until night, she moved through routines designed to uphold the structure of the family, not herself. If her husband was kind, she might be allowed small freedoms, to visit neighbors, to manage money for the market, to rest if she was ill. If he was cruel, she had little recourse. Violence within marriage was not illegal. So long as it was not excessive, it was considered discipline. The church advised men to be gentle, but few enforced that advice. The law protected the sanctity of marriage, not the safety of wives. Some women survived marriage by building quiet lives within it. They found peace in gardens, in spinning wool, in raising children they loved fiercely. They created networks of female companionship, speaking in low voices while baking bread or fetching water. They told each other stories, sometimes funny, sometimes full of warning. These relationships became lifelines. Others coped through devotion. Religious faith offered meaning, structure, and a place for grief. A wife who suffered might look to the Virgin Mary or to female saints who endured pain with patience. Prayer became a form of release, sometimes the only one. A few women managed to shape their marriages into partnerships. These were rare. They depended on a balance of temperament, on unusual respect, on shared hardship that turned into mutual care. But these stories were not common. Most marriages remained unequal, and the love that did exist had to fit into a structure that never truly allowed a woman to be free. There were no divorces as we know them. Separation was possible only under extreme circumstances, abandonment, proven abuse, or certain religious technicalities. Even then, a woman rarely gained her freedom. She might be sent back to her father, live alone in shame, or be forced into a convent. Remarriage was difficult unless her husband died. Widowhood was one of the few paths to relative independence. A widow, especially one without sons, could inherit some control over land or money. She might run a household alone, manage a shop, or rejoin a community of women. But this freedom came at a cost. It followed loss. It followed years of service and silence. And even then, she remained at risk from relatives, from in-laws, from the law itself. And so, marriage continued, generation after generation. A cycle of arrangements, of duties, of expectations met without question. For some women, it became their identity. For others, it became a quiet sorrow. Most had no choice but to accept it. And in accepting it, they found ways to survive, to create beauty where they could, to teach their daughters gently, to protect their sons from the worst parts of their fathers, to keep something of themselves hidden and whole deep inside. Not because marriage deserved their love, but because they deserved to feel human. And sometimes that had to be enough. Motherhood in early youth. She was still a child when they called her mother. Her hands, once small and busy with household chores, now carried the weight of a new life. Her body, barely finished growing, had been asked to give birth. No one questioned if she was ready. Readiness was not part of the conversation. If she could bleed, she could conceive. If she could conceive, she could give birth. If she could give birth, she could raise a child. That was the logic of her world. It was simple. It was cruel. It was accepted. Pregnancy came quickly for many young brides, sometimes in the first year, sometimes even before they understood what pregnancy truly meant. One missed cycle, and the whispers began. One swollen belly, and the women of the household leaned in with advice, warnings, prayers. Some smiled with approval. Others looked at her with quiet pity. They remembered what it felt like. The aching bones, the fear, the exhaustion, the hope that the child would survive, the deeper hope that they themselves would survive. There were no doctors for most women, no hospitals, no trained midwives in every village. Just other women, older and experienced, who had seen enough births to know what to do when things went well, and what to expect when they didn't. There were herbs, hot cloths, cold hands, wooden spoons to bite, prayers muttered under the breath, icons of saints placed near the bed. But there were no guarantees. For a girl of 13 or 14, labor was especially dangerous. Her hips were narrow, her muscles were weak, her blood was thin. Some survived and went on to carry many more children. Others bled too much, or the baby came sideways, or the cord twisted, or there was no breath when the child came out, and the room went quiet. If she lived, she was praised. A good wife, a strong girl. But if she died, there would be a new wife soon enough. Life moved forward quickly, even when it was heavy with loss. And if the child survived, her work had only just begun. She now had a baby to feed, to wash, to carry. Day and night, her arms would never rest. Her sleep would be broken, her meals eaten in haste. Her body would no longer be hers, not fully. It would feed another. It would serve another. It would belong to her child as much as it belonged to her husband, her house, her world. She might still look like a girl, her skin still soft, her shoulders still narrow, but now she was called mother. She was expected to know things, to do things, to be strong for someone else. And most of all, she was expected not to complain. There was no space for doubt, no time to be overwhelmed. The other women might help at first, show her how to wrap the baby, how to keep it warm in winter, how to stop the fever, how to pray when the child would not eat. But soon, she was expected to manage alone. And if the baby cried too long, she would be blamed. If it grew weak, she would be blamed. If it died, she would carry that loss in silence. There would be no counselor, no priest to comfort her, no voice to say, "You are not at fault." Grief was private, unspoken. It lived behind the eyes, in the stillness of her hands, in the hollow way she moved through her chores. She would go on, because she had to, because there might be another child soon, and another after that. Some girls had 10, 12, 15 births in their lives. Some watched more children die than survive. Some grew strong in their silence. Others faded, slowly, quietly, as if life itself was pulled from them, one child at a time. There was no word for postpartum, no understanding of the toll it took, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the weight of invisible pressure. If she wept, it was called weakness. If she withdrew, it was called coldness. If she failed to smile, it was considered shameful. And still, she fed, she sang, she wrapped the infant to her chest and kept working. Because the house needed her, the fields needed her husband needed her, the child needed her, and her needs, they did not come up in conversation. There were moments, small ones, when she felt something close to peace. The baby asleep in her arms. The quiet sound of breath in a dark room. The soft scent of milk and wool. A whispered lullaby she remembered from her own childhood, now sung in a different voice, a different rhythm. Sometimes she would look at the baby and feel a love so deep it frightened her, a need to protect that overwhelmed everything else. And sometimes she would look and feel nothing, only fatigue, only worry, only the deep, sharp ache of a life that moved too fast. But she kept going. Even as her body broke down, even as her spine curved from years of lifting, even as her skin stretched and scarred, even as she bled again and again and again. Some husbands noticed. A few offered kindness, a warm blanket, a quieter tone. Most did not. Most assumed this was normal, expected, the price of being a woman. And if she could not meet that price, she could be replaced with a younger girl, a stronger one who had not yet carried so much. And so, she carried more than just children. She carried silence. She carried fear. She carried the memory of what she once hoped for and the acceptance of what had become her life. Motherhood changed her, not only in body, but in spirit. It taught her to wait, to endure, to give more than she thought possible, to feel everything and still keep moving. And in that quiet, brutal world, she became a force of nature. Not loud, not praised, but essential. No one wrote poems about her. No statues were carved. No songs were sung in her name. But without her, nothing would have survived, giving birth without knowledge or care. She knew she was with child, but she did not fully know what that meant. No one explained the process in detail. No diagrams, no books, no gentle conversations, only signs, only silence, only the knowledge passed in half whispers from one woman to another, often too late. She noticed the changes in her body, the swelling, the nausea, the ache in her back, the heaviness in her limbs. She worked through it. There was no pause, no exception, no rest. Pregnancy did not exempt her from duty. If anything, it increased it. She had to prove herself capable, not just as a wife, but now as a mother-to-be. The women around her offered glances, nods, and the occasional brief suggestion. Don't lift too much. Eat when you can. Pray more. Some offered herbs. Others offered advice rooted in superstition. Avoid cold air. Tie iron near the bed. Speak softly so the baby will be gentle. But nothing was certain. And no one stayed long enough to guide her through every stage. Her husband expected results, not questions. The growing belly was proof of her worth. His legacy taking form. His name growing inside her. She was praised if she carried well, if she did not complain, if she continued her duties as if nothing had changed. To show pain was weakness. To rest was laziness. The best women, she was told, gave birth between chores, washed laundry in the morning, bore children before dusk. As the months passed, the child shifted. Her bones ached in ways she didn't have names for. Her feet swelled. Sleep came in restless stretches, but she remained quiet. She smiled when expected. She did not speak of her fear. There was no regular checkup, no midwife assigned early. In some places, trained midwives existed. In others, she would rely on neighbors, on a cousin, on an aunt who had seen a dozen births and survived most. These women were experienced, but they had little more than instinct. No instruments, no sterile tools, just cloths, bowls, and prayer. When the pains began, she was told to lie down. Not in a hospital, not in a clean bed, on a blanket, on straw, on wooden boards, wherever the household could spare the space. The room was dark. A single candle might burn. Someone might boil water, though not always. She was often alone for long stretches. The labor could last hours or days. There was no medication, no relief. She was told to breathe, to bite on cloth, to scream only if she must. and sometimes she did. She pushed through pain that tore through her like fire. She felt the world narrowing, everything collapsing into pressure and heat. The other women encouraged her, but quietly. No one wanted to frighten her more, but they knew. They had seen things go wrong. They had buried babies. They had watched mothers bleed. And they knew that sometimes, even when everything seemed fine, it wasn't. She prayed in those moments, even if she hadn't been devout before. She whispered to saints, to God, to her mother, if she had lost her, to anyone who might be listening. She did not ask for ease. She asked only to live, to see the child, to hold it once, to wake up the next day. If the birth was smooth, the baby would arrive in wet silence or with a sudden cry. The room would exhale. The mother would collapse. And then the work would begin again. Cutting the cord, washing the baby, coaxing the first feed, cleaning the blood. She was not left to rest. She was expected to recover quickly, to hold the baby, to smile, to be grateful. If the birth was not smooth, there were few options. A baby stuck could mean hours of agony. A breech could mean a death sentence. There were no cesareans, no emergency care, no surgeries, only desperate hands and fading hope. Some babies were stillborn. Some mothers bled too much. The body, after all, had limits. When death came, it came silently. There were no alarms, no cries in hospital corridors, just a quiet stillness. A candle left burning. A midwife sitting back. A husband pacing outside. And a body, still warm, now still. But most women survived, somehow. Bruised, broken, torn, but alive. And with life came the expectation to resume, to nurse, to clean, to rise the next morning and sweep the floor, baby wrapped tight against her chest. There was no reflection, no therapy, no rest. What she had experienced was not called trauma. It was called womanhood. And it was repeated again and again, every few years, until her body could carry no more. She bore children in sickness, in winter, in grief, during war, during famine. She bore children after burying others. She bore children when she had no strength left. She bore children in silence and raised them in service. She might speak to other women about her birth, in brief, coded language. It was hard. The second was worse. I thought I wouldn't make it, but never in public, never in front of men, never with the honesty it deserved. And the children, they didn't know. They grew up hearing stories of saints and kings, not of the woman who bled for them, not of the quiet courage that brought them into the world. She fed them with hands that trembled. She rocked them while her wounds still healed. She loved them fiercely, or she didn't. Some women could not find love after the pain. Some tried, but felt numb. Some smiled, but felt lost inside. Yet they were praised, called strong, called natural, called blessed. And when another pregnancy came, as it always did, she bore it without question, because to question was dangerous, because to resist was unthinkable, because the world did not ask how she felt, only whether she was ready again. She wasn't, but she said nothing. And so the cycle continued, women's illness and folk remedies. Her body was always working, It carried water, lifted children, knelt in prayer, prepared meals, bled each month, labored through birth, and woke before the sun. And with that constant labor came pain. Quiet, unending, often ignored. Pain was a companion. It lived in her joints, her stomach, her lower back. It waited in her shoulders, her hips, her eyes. But she rarely named it, because illness, for women, was not seen as a disruption. It was a condition of life. Women in the Middle Ages lived in a world without modern medicine. There were no hospitals for most of them, no doctors trained in women's bodies, no sterile tools, no understanding of bacteria or hormones. The female body was a mystery, even to those who studied it. It was feared. It was misunderstood. It was controlled. When a woman became ill, she did not always say so. Complaints were often met with suspicion or dismissal. If the work needed doing, she was expected to push through, and most did. They worked with fever, with aching limbs, with infections and fatigue. They kept going until they collapsed, and even then, they often stood up again. Some illnesses were seen as divine punishment. A stomach cramp might be blamed on impure thoughts, a headache on laziness, bleeding disorders on sin. Doctors, when available, were men. They rarely examined women directly. Instead, they asked questions to a male relative, or issued vague remedies from books written centuries before. And so, women turned to each other. Healing was a shared art, passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to friend. It lived in the garden, in the woods, in whispered advice at the hearth. The knowledge was practical, rooted in plants, timing, and patience. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always safe. But it was something. And for many women, it was all they had. There were herbs for the womb, for the head, for the nerves, for the milk, mugwort for menstrual flow, pennyroyal to bring on a late period, though dangerous in high doses, chamomile to calm the belly, rue to chase out fever, willow bark for pain, elderflower for colds, wormwood for worms, and lavender, always lavender, to ease the mind. They made salves and teas, soaked cloths in vinegar, boiled roots in rainwater. They tied charms to belts, hung garlic in windows, kept iron under the bed. They read the moon, the weather, the wind. Healing was part science, part faith, part ritual. It was not just about the body. It was about balance, spirit, energy. Women who knew these things were both valued and feared. Some were called wise. Others were called witches. The line was thin. A woman who healed too well, who cured what a priest could not, who whispered to herbs more than to saints, she became dangerous. If her remedies worked, she was watched. If they failed, she was blamed. Still, the women kept practicing. They knew how to tend wounds, how to soothe a crying child, how to bind a sprain, how to treat a cough that rattled in the lungs, and more importantly, they knew how to comfort. When someone was dying, it was the women who sat by the bed. They sang, they prayed, they placed cool cloths on hot foreheads. They held hands that trembled. They did not turn away. There were remedies for melancholy, too, though no one called it depression. A woman who stopped speaking, who wept for no reason, who could not sleep or could not wake. She might be treated with St. John's wort or a tincture of honey and rose. She might be bathed in warm water, told to rest, or told to work harder. Sometimes both. Sometimes neither helped. After childbirth, many women became ill. Their bodies fragile, their spirits shaken. Some bled too long, some developed infections, some withdrew completely. The other women noticed. They gave tonics. They offered herbs. They watched quietly, knowing there was no name for what was happening, no cure, only time, or not enough of it. For women nearing the end of their fertility, there were other changes. The bleeding stopped. The body shifted. Hot flashes, sleepless nights, mood swings. Again, no names, no understanding. Just the sense that something in them was changing. Some embraced it. Others feared it. Few spoke of it. And when old age came, if it came, it brought its own pain. The knees stiffened. The hands curled. The breath grew shallow. But old women were respected sometimes. Feared, too. They had survived, and survival brought authority. They became the keepers of remedies, of warnings, of memories. They taught the young women not just how to heal, but how to endure. They reminded them that pain was not new, that the body could be both fragile and fierce, that silence was not the same as weakness, that sometimes healing had nothing to do with curing and everything to do with caring. Most women never saw a physician. Those who did often regretted it. The doctors used tools that hurt, bled them to balance humors, applied leeches, recommended strange diets. Rarely did they listen. Rarer still did they stay. A woman's suffering was, to them, an ordinary inconvenience, a thing to be noted, not felt. And so women turned inward, to their knowledge, their plants, their prayers, their strength. They knew that their bodies were not trusted, not by men, not by the church, not by the law, but they knew their own rhythms. They tracked their bleeding with moon cycles. They knew the signs of infection before fever. They knew how to listen to the skin, the breath, the eyes. They did not call themselves healers. They simply helped. And they helped quietly, without recognition, without payment, without protection. They were the mothers, the midwives, the herbalists, the comforters. They moved from house to house, holding baskets of roots and cloths and oil. They sat by bedsides. They buried the dead, and then they returned home, lit their own fire, and waited for the next knock. The pain never left, but neither did their knowledge. And in that space, between hurt and healing, between what was known and what was felt, they survived, living with pain, the physical cost of daily life. She woke before the sky turned gray. Her hands ached before they moved. Her knees crackled when she stood. Her back pulled tight, stiff from sleep on straw, stiff from the weight of every day before. The air was cold. Her feet touched the floor slowly, one at a time. There was no time to stretch, no one to ask how she felt. The day had begun, and so had the pain. She was not sick, not exactly. No fever, no wound, no bleeding. But her body hurt, in quiet ways, in lingering ways. Her muscles remembered lifting too much, too young. Her wrists remembered years of twisting cloth, of grinding grain, of scrubbing stone. Her legs remembered the fields. Her shoulders remembered the yoke of heavy buckets, balanced on either side of her thin frame. Pain was not unusual. It was not discussed. It was not even named. It was simply there, as familiar as breathing, as present as her own shadow. The pain was worse in winter. The cold crept into her bones. Her fingers moved slower. Her hips resisted every step. But still, she worked. She fed the fire. She kneaded the dough. She pulled water from the well. She climbed stairs with baskets of laundry. She bent and stood, again and again, while her spine begged for pause. No one asked if she was hurting. If they did, she wouldn't have answered. What was the point? There was nothing to be done. No medicine. No rest. If she stopped, something would be left undone. And someone, husband, child, elder, would go without. That was not acceptable, so she did not stop. There was always work to do, always. She moved in patterns, morning chores, midday cooking, evening mending. Her hands were never still. They were dry, cracked, and red from hot water and rough fabric. Her fingertips were burned, cut, calloused, but they kept going. Even when the skin split, even when the joints swelled, even when sleep offered no relief. She rarely sat for long. When she did, it was with something in her lap. Thread, vegetables, a restless baby. Sitting was not rest. Rest was not allowed. And yet, she endured. She learned to carry pain without reacting to it. She smiled when expected. She stood up when summoned. She walked through the village with a straight back, even when every step sent sparks through her knees. She learned to hide the wince, to slow down just enough to manage, to not be noticed. Pain had a rhythm. It flared in the morning, eased slightly in motion, returned at night heavier. Sometimes it pulsed behind her eyes. Sometimes it hummed in her teeth. Sometimes it curled in her belly like a warning. Some days were worse. When the weather shifted, when the air was damp, when she bled, when she hadn't slept. On those days, her breath grew shallow. She moved slower, but still, she moved. She took what small help she could. A warm cloth on her knees, a brief bath if water was plentiful, a salve made by an old neighbor, beeswax and pine and something bitter. It helped. Not much, but enough to go on. Some women shared remedies. Others shared silence. A look, a nod, a shared understanding. You too? Yes, always. They spoke of pain with their eyes. There were names for certain hurts: the childbed ache, the winter bones, the working hand. But mostly, pain was not named. Naming it made it too large, too real, and there was no space for that. Some husbands noticed, some did not. Some asked why she moved so slowly, why she sighed when she sat, why she gripped the table before standing. She would shrug, "It's nothing." And maybe he believed her. Maybe he didn't care. Her children saw her in motion. Always, they saw her hands, rough like bark. They saw her feet swollen and red. They saw her sleep sitting up because lying down hurt too much. But they did not ask. Children learned not to ask. And if she lived long enough, the pain became something deeper. Not sharp, not sudden, but woven into her. She forgot what it was like to move without stiffness. She adjusted her pace, her posture, her routine. She favored one leg. She bent from the waist. She gripped chairs before lowering herself. Her body adapted because it had no choice. And yet, through it all, she loved. She loved while hurting. She worked while hurting. She comforted others while hurting. She sat by sick beds while aching herself. She walked to church on aching feet. She held babies on burning shoulders. She sang lullabies through clenched teeth. She did not break. She bent, quietly, slowly, again and again. She rarely asked for help, because asking implied she expected to receive it. And most of the time, there was no one to help, so she carried it all. Her body bore witness to a life of service. Scars, stiffness, sagging muscles, hands that shook after a long day, arms that trembled holding heavy pots, eyes that watered from the fire, from fatigue, from nothing at all. She grew older before her time. Some women collapsed. Their bodies simply gave out. A slipped disc, a torn ligament, a fever that would not go. And when that happened, everything shifted. Suddenly, she was not useful, and usefulness was value. A woman who could not work became a burden, but many pushed through, well past the point of safety. They limped, they winced, they whispered prayers as they lifted buckets. Pain was never treated, it was endured. And yet, there was power in that, a quiet power, not the kind sung by poets, not the kind written in law, but real, strong, present in every motion, every quiet breath, every soft step on a wooden floor. She did not seek praise. She sought peace. In small moments, a beam of sunlight, a warm bowl of soup, a grandchild's laughter, the sound of rain on the roof, while her hands rested, if only for a moment. She never stopped hurting, but she never stopped living. And that, too, was strength. Women's labor in field and home. She did not rest. When the sun rose, she rose with it or before it. While the village still slept, while the roosters still gathered their breath, she was moving, tying her hair, lighting the fire, fetching water, warming bread, preparing for a day that would never truly end. Her labor was constant, quiet, expected. In the medieval world, a woman's work was rarely written down. It was not praised in books, not celebrated in stories. It was not called a trade or a profession. But without it, the village could not function. The household would crumble. The food would not cook. The children would not be clean. The men would not be fed. The clothes would not be mended. The candles would not be made. The walls would not be swept. And still, she was called idle if she ever sat. There was no such thing as a housewife as we think of it now, because the home was not just a place to rest. It was a place of production. She made almost everything they used. She did not buy soap. She made it. She did not order clothing. She spun it, wove it, stitched it, cleaned it, patched it, restitched it. She churned butter. She dried herbs. She salted meat. She boiled bones for broth. She turned waste into compost. She turned scraps into fuel. She turned labor into survival. And when she left the home, the work continued. The fields needed her too. Women worked beside their husbands, brothers, and sons. They dug, they weeded, they planted, they harvested. Their hands gripped the same tools, their backs bent under the same sun. Their feet sank into the same mud. They tied sacks of grain. They hauled bundles of flax. They carried baskets of apples, onions, leeks. They did not do this once or twice a year. They did this every season, every day, whenever it was needed. They were also shepherds, bakers, millers, brewers. They tended bees, collected honey, tanned hides, sharpened knives. Some women ran alehouses from their kitchens. Others sold cheese or eggs in the market. Some even managed family businesses while their husbands were away, at war, on the road, or buried in the ground. Their labor was everywhere. And still, they were not called laborers. They were helpers, assistants, shadows behind the name of a man. In the fields, they often worked in silence, hands busy, minds elsewhere, watching the weather, watching the children, watching the bread they left rising back at home. Sometimes they sang quiet songs, old ones passed from mother to daughter, songs about the sun, the rain, the gods, the saints, songs to keep rhythm, to pass time, to remind themselves they were still there. Children followed them everywhere. Babies in slings, toddlers tugging skirts, older girls mimicking the motions, boys running between chores and games. A woman's work was never hers alone. It was shared, passed down, but always expected. She worked while sick, while pregnant, while bleeding, while grieving. The cows still needed milking. The oven still needed tending. The wool still needed carding. No excuse could stop it. She might pause, but she would not rest. Some women worked in larger households as servants, maids, nurses, cooks. Their labor was the same, but it belonged to someone else. Their hands cleaned another woman's floors, cooked another man's meals, raised children that were not their own, and still they were considered low, disposable, replaceable. Others worked in monasteries or manors or convents. Some found slightly easier lives there, but most still worked with their bodies. Long hours, heavy lifting, daily routines that offered no softness. Their tools were simple: brooms made of twigs, wooden spoons, iron pots, stone mortars. They did not have machines. Their strength came from habit, from necessity, from the simple fact that no one else would do it if they didn't. There were no days off. Sundays were holy, but not restful. Even then, water was fetched. Children were cleaned. Meals were prepared. Clothes were mended in the evening light, while hymns echoed from the church. Some women were proud of their work, and rightly so. Their houses were clean. Their families fed. Their gardens grew strong. Their tools were well cared for. They took pride in discipline, in order, in survival. They found beauty in the glow of a hearth, in the perfect crust of a baked loaf, in the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. But pride did not bring rest, and no one thanked them. Their husbands expected meals without comment. Their children expected clean clothes without noticing. The village expected everything to function, and if it didn't, they asked the woman what she had done wrong. And so she kept working, day after day, year after year, even as her hands curled with age, even as her back bowed, even as her pace slowed to a shuffle, even as her breath shortened and her eyes blurred. She still moved through her home, touching everything, adjusting, correcting, completing, until she couldn't. Then, if she was lucky, a younger woman took her place. A daughter-in-law, a girl who had been watching for years, learning by doing. Because no one taught these things with words. They were taught with motion, with repetition, with expectation. And the cycle began again. Not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. The work was heavy, the tools were simple, the praise was absent, the rest was brief. But without her, nothing worked. And though her name might be lost, though her voice might be missing from the stories, her hands shaped every single day of medieval life. Unseen strength, unpaid, unacknowledged work. She worked every day, from the moment her eyes opened to the moment they finally closed again in the dark. She worked in silence, in shadows, in the quiet rhythm of routine. And yet, her work was not called labor. It was not written down. It was not paid. It was not praised. It was simply expected. In the medieval world, a woman's work was invisible by design. Her hands held the fabric of life together, but no one spoke her name when the harvest was good, or when the house was clean, or when the fire kept burning through the night. Her success was measured by absence, of complaint, of disorder, of failure. If everything went well, no one noticed. If something fell apart, she was the first to blame. She did not count her hours, because there were no hours to count. Time blurred into duty. She rose with the sun, or before it, and moved through the day in a series of necessary actions: preparing food, feeding livestock, nursing children, sweeping, scrubbing, sewing, washing the same piece of cloth for the third time that week, folding and unfolding, fetching, carrying, repairing, remaking. None of it paid, all of it essential. Her labor had no coin attached to it, no tally, no ledger, but it kept her family alive. It kept her village functioning. It allowed others, mostly men, to work in ways the world valued, in fields, in trade, in writing, in war. Without her work at home, none of their work could be done, and yet she remained in the background, her name forgotten even in her own household. Sometimes she helped in her husband's craft, spinning wool for his weaving, gathering herbs for his tinctures, managing the shop when he was away. But the credit went to him. He signed the papers. He owned the goods. She kept the place alive, but it was not hers. If she sold bread, cheese, eggs, or ale in the market, it was called a favor, a bit of extra income, never a profession. If she brewed, she was a good wife. If she baked, she was fulfilling her duty. If she raised children, she was only doing what women do. There was no recognition for how much she gave. No one counted how many nights she stayed awake with a sick child. No one noted how often she went without food so her family could eat. No one recorded the hours she spent in prayer, in worry, in stitching seams that would hold through another winter. Her work filled every corner of her life, but her name was left out of the records. Even the church, which praised female virtue, rarely acknowledged female effort. Saints were honored for martyrdom, not for mending, for vision, not for daily care. The woman who kept her home from falling apart, who nursed the dying, who taught her children to speak and survive. She was not mentioned in sermons. Her labor was too ordinary to be holy, and yet it was sacred. Because in her hands, the world kept turning. Quietly, steadily, without applause. Some women felt pride in this, a quiet satisfaction in seeing the floor clean, the stew bubbling, the children resting safely in bed. They knew they had done something meaningful, even if no one said so. Others felt resentment, a hollow ache that came from being needed but not seen, being depended on but never thanked, being essential but never honored. Sometimes she cried alone in the corner of a cold room when the baby finally slept, or outside, beside the washing stones where no one could hear. The tears came from exhaustion, from the endlessness of it all, from the knowledge that tomorrow would look the same, that no rest was coming, that no one would ever say, "You've done enough." And still, she continued, because she had no choice, and because deep down, she believed in what she did, not because it was easy, but because it mattered, even if the world refused to admit it. There were no medals for raising children who survived, no awards for preserving food for winter, no public thanks for keeping her husband fed, her home warm, her clothing repaired, her neighbors cared for. These were not seen as accomplishments. They were simply life. But they were more than that. They were survival, continuity, stability. They were the unnoticed backbone of an entire society. She did not ask for praise. She asked only for fairness, for a moment of stillness, for a night without interruption, for a day when her body didn't ache from the moment she stood, and sometimes she received it, briefly. A kind word from a neighbor, a moment of laughter with her sister, a song sung softly while she scrubbed the floor. Those moments were not enough to erase the injustice, but they helped her continue. And that was enough for one more day. Her daughters watched her, learned from her, imitated her. They grew up thinking this was normal, that to give everything and expect nothing was the natural way of being a woman. And many of them carried that belief into their own lives. But some began to question, quietly at first. Why does no one speak her name? Why do her hands, worn and cracked, receive no reward? Why does the world depend on her and then forget her? And slowly, over time, the silence began to break. A few voices remembered her. A few records appeared. A few poems were written not for queens, but for mothers, for laborers, for midwives, for bakers, for women who made history not through battle, but through bread. And even now, centuries later, we whisper her name again. Not because it was ever famous, but because it should have been. Because the world she held together piece by piece, deserves to be seen. Because strength does not need an audience to be real. Because what is unpaid is not worthless. Because what is unseen is not forgotten. Property and inheritance. Nothing of her own. She lived her entire life within walls she did not own. She stirred pots over fires built with wood she did not control. She raised children in houses where every nail and beam belonged to someone else. Her bed was not hers. Her blankets were not hers. Even the tools she used, the iron pot, the spindle, the knife, belonged legally to a man, a father, a husband, a son. She did not question it, at least not aloud. It was simply the way of things. Men held property, women held responsibilities. Heirs were male, names passed down through sons. If she came from a wealthy family, she brought a dowry, land, coin, livestock. But none of it remained in her hands. The moment she married, it passed into the control of her husband. Her name may have been on the parchment, but it meant nothing without his. Even if she worked the land, tilled the soil, milked the cows, sowed the grain, and harvested the crop, the land was not hers. If her husband died, it passed to a son, a brother, an uncle, a cousin. If no male heir existed, it might revert to the Lord. In rare cases, she might be allowed to manage the land temporarily as a placeholder, a steward, until a proper male owner could be arranged. She did not inherit, she held, and always she waited for it to be taken. A woman's legal identity was absorbed by her marriage. She could not sign contracts alone. She could not bring a case to court in her own name. If she was wronged, she needed her husband to speak for her. If she was abused, the law often turned away. And if she left him, which was nearly impossible, she left everything behind. She could not will her possessions. She could not pass on property as a man might. If she had a trinket box, a necklace, a ring, it might go to her daughter, but only if no one else claimed it, only if it had no value, only if it escaped notice. And even in death, her body was not hers to bury, as she wished. Her husband chose the church. The priest chose the words. Her name was spoken once, perhaps, then covered in dirt, forgotten beneath stone. Some women lived in homes that once belonged to their fathers. They walked through halls they remembered from childhood, but they walked them as guests, as wives, as caretakers of another man's domain. Their memories did not matter. Their labor was invisible. Their history was erased, replaced by the names of men etched into ledgers, into walls, into gravestones. Others married into wealth, but had no access to it. The coins were counted by men. The chests were locked. The keys were kept elsewhere. She might be given an allowance, but it was small, and always with conditions. It was not hers to save. It was not hers to give away. It could be revoked at will. She managed households filled with goods, salt, meat, linen, wool, but none of it belonged to her. She kept inventories, supervised servants, organized feasts. She oversaw kitchens and pantries, but she had no legal claim to what passed through her hands. It passed through her, not to her. In some cities, widows had limited rights. If they outlived their husbands and had no sons, They could take temporary control of businesses, properties, and even guild memberships. But they were exceptions. And even then, they lived in uncertainty, knowing a cousin or a local lord might take it back at any time. In villages, the rules were even stricter. Land was the most precious thing, and land was male. A woman might marry a farmer and live on his field for 50 years, yet still be asked to leave the day he died. Her sons might protect her. Her daughters could not. If she had no sons, she had no anchor. There were women who defied these rules, widows who fought in court, nuns who owned land through the church, merchants who built wealth so carefully that no one dared challenge them. But these stories were rare, and most ended quietly. A loss in court, a forced remarriage, a signed agreement she did not fully understand. Women were taught not to want ownership. They were taught to want stability, safety, respect. They were told that love was more valuable than land, that a husband was protection, that property was a burden, that ambition was dangerous, and many believed it, not because it was true, but because it made life easier to endure. Still, there were moments. A garden she tended for years, where every plant grew from her hand. A loom she used since girlhood, whose patterns bore her signature. A cottage corner she claimed as her own, where she kept her letters, her beads, her thoughts. These were hers, not in law, but in spirit, in practice, in truth. She protected them fiercely. If someone moved her herbs, she noticed. If someone borrowed her knife, she asked for it back. She had so little that was hers, and even that little meant everything. And sometimes she dreamed of what it would feel like to own the land she walked, to choose where she lived, to pass on her work, her name, her story, without permission, to write her will, to speak her mind in court, to keep what she earned, to give what she wished, to be more than a keeper, to be a name that lasted. But dreams did not change laws. So she lived within the rules, quietly, carefully, making what she could out of what she was allowed, holding her head high in homes that were never hers, teaching her daughters not how to claim space, but how to survive without it. And still, within those narrow walls, she built lives. She carved meaning. She shaped entire families, not as owner, not as heir, but as something deeper, as the root beneath the foundation, the stone beneath the house. Her name may not appear on the deeds, but everything she touched still carries the shape of her hands, the church's role. Virgin, mother, or sinner. She walked through the heavy wooden doors, her head covered, her eyes lowered. The church was cool and dim, lit by flickering candles and pale morning light that slipped through stained glass. The smell of stone, wax, and old incense filled the space. The benches creaked beneath her. The air was still. This was where she came to listen, to confess, to ask forgiveness for things she barely understood, to be reminded who she was, and more often, who she was not. In the Middle Ages, the church was not just a place. It was a presence. It shaped every part of her life, from the cradle to the grave. It told her what was holy and what was shameful. It taught her how to behave, what to fear, what to hope for, and what to accept. The church did not speak softly. It spoke in rules, in roles, in categories. For women, there were three. She could be a virgin, pure, untouched, silent, and praised. She could be a mother, devoted, fertile, obedient, and useful. Or she could be a sinner, fallen, defiant, broken, and feared. There was no space in between. From a young age, she was taught the value of chastity. Virginity was prized above knowledge, curiosity, or skill. It was her honor, her worth, her only true gift. If she lost it before marriage, by choice or by force, she lost everything. And if she kept it, she was holy, sacred, closer to the Virgin Mary, who was both mother and untouched, both perfect and unreachable. The Virgin Mary was her model, her ideal, her unreachable mirror. Mary did not complain. Mary did not desire. Mary obeyed. Mary suffered with grace. This was what the church told her to become. Not powerful, not independent, not heard, but patient, soft, faithful. And so she tried. She knelt in confession and recited sins she barely knew were wrong. She confessed impatience, jealousy, wandering thoughts, the temptation of vanity. She listened to sermons that warned against female pride, female temptation, female speech. She saw Eve blamed for the fall of man. She learned that her body could cause men to stumble, and that it was her responsibility to prevent that. She covered her hair. She lowered her gaze. She silenced her voice. When she became a wife, the church told her to serve her husband as she would serve God. Her body was no longer hers. It was his by right, and to deny him was to sin. Even in marriage, desire was discouraged. Passion was dangerous. Pleasure was suspect. A good wife gave quietly, endured gracefully, prayed constantly. If she became a mother, the church blessed her, but only conditionally. Childbirth was both miracle and punishment, a reminder of Eve's sin, a path to salvation, but only through pain. She was told to raise her children in fear of the Lord, to be strict but loving, to be invisible but ever present. If her child died, and many did, she was told it was God's will. If she wept too long, she was told to have faith, to let go, to trust the divine plan. Her grief had to be private. Her sorrow had to be brief. If she remained unmarried, she was suspect. An unmarried woman was unanchored, unowned, a threat to order. She might be drawn to temptation. She might be dangerous. The church offered her one escape: the convent. To become a nun was to step outside one set of rules and into another. Nuns lived in prayer, in silence, in submission. But they also read, taught, wrote. Some became scholars, visionaries, respected voices. But they gave up everything: family, property, freedom, even their names. They belonged to God entirely. That was the trade. For most women, The church was not a path to freedom. It was a boundary, a guide, a cage with gilded edges. And still, it was a comfort, because the world was hard, and the church offered meaning. It gave her words to say when she didn't know what to feel. It gave her rituals to follow when her life felt empty. It gave her a place to cry without question. A candle to light when everything else had gone dark. She came to the church with questions. Why had her child died? Why had her body failed? Why did her husband hurt her? Why did she feel so small? And the church answered, but not always kindly. It told her to be patient, to pray harder, to accept her trials as holy, to find grace in obedience. And sometimes that was enough. A quiet hour in the pews, a whispered prayer, the echo of her own voice in a stone room, a moment of stillness. But the church did not defend her. If she was raped, she was often blamed. If she spoke out, she was silenced. If she questioned too much, she was accused. Some women were burned, others were exiled, others simply erased. The church protected the order of things, and she was not part of that order, not truly. And yet, she stayed. Because where else could she go? And because not all within the church were cruel. Some priests were kind, some monks listened, some nuns taught her letters, some offered real comfort. Some saw her not as a role, but as a soul. And in those moments, the divine felt closer. Not in doctrine, but in compassion. She held on to those moments. A hymn that brought her peace, a saint's story that mirrored her own pain. A candle flickering in the dark, reminding her she was not alone. She found her own ways to believe, in quiet saints, forgotten martyrs, gentle rituals. She spoke to Mary as if to a sister. She asked questions in prayer that she could never ask aloud. She gave thanks in silence, forgiveness in motion, grace in action. Her faith did not look like power. It looked like survival. She kept the rhythms of holy days. She fasted. She gave alms. She taught her children to cross themselves before eating. She wore a cross around her neck, worn smooth by her fingers. And when she died, she hoped to be remembered. Not as perfect, not as pure, but as faithful in her way. The church may not have written her name in its books, but she wrote it in candlelight, in bread shared, in kindness offered when no one was watching. In her own way, she was holy, penance and virtue, the rules that bound her. She lived in a world of rules, not written in her own hand, not explained with care, but learned through repetition, through warnings, through watching others be corrected. From the moment she could walk without holding her mother's skirt, she began to understand what was expected, not just what she must do, but how she must be, what to wear, how to speak, when to lower her eyes, when to keep her voice still, when to smile, even if she was afraid. Virtue was not a suggestion. It was survival. She was told to be good, but goodness was not freedom. It was restriction. It was obedience. It was silence. To be virtuous, she had to surrender. her desires, her anger, her doubts, her dreams. To be called a good woman was to carry 100 invisible burdens without letting them show. She was warned early about sin, not just the great sins, theft, violence, cruelty, but the small ones that seemed to live inside her body. Vanity, pride, laziness, jealousy, disobedience, lust. She learned that her feelings could betray her, that her thoughts were dangerous, that her body was a source of temptation, not just to herself, but to others. If a man looked at her too long, it was her fault. If her dress was too bright, if her hair was uncovered, if her laugh was too loud, she might lead someone astray. And so she learned to disappear, to hide in modesty, to walk with careful steps, to fold herself into smaller spaces. Confession was a regular part of her life. Kneeling on stone, hands clasped, voice low, she listed her faults. Sometimes they were real. Sometimes they were made up, just to have something to say. The priest asked questions. Did you disobey your husband? Did you envy another woman? Did you resist your duties? Did you take too long to pray? Did you think about someone who was not your husband? And when she answered, she received her penance, a number of prayers, a time of fasting, a warning to do better. Sometimes forgiveness felt real. Sometimes it felt like fear. Virtue was always being measured, not only by the church, but by her neighbors, by her family, by the eyes of her community. A single rumor could undo everything. If someone said she looked at a man the wrong way, or took too long in the market, or missed a service at church, or stayed out too late, or spoke too boldly, or sang too freely, she knew of women who were cast out for less. So she kept herself guarded. Every movement calculated, every word considered. Even joy had to be moderate. Laughter was suspicious. Dancing was sinful, unless under very specific rules. Music was allowed, but only the right kind. Love was fine, but only within marriage. Pride in her own work was frowned upon. She was meant to be humble, always. And when she suffered, she was expected to do so quietly. Pain, after all, was virtuous. Suffering was a path to holiness. The saints suffered. Mary suffered. To endure without complaint was to become closer to the divine. So she bore her grief like a blessing. She carried loss as if it was a gift. She was told it made her stronger, but she did not always feel strong. Sometimes she felt tired, not just in her body, but in her soul. Tired of being watched, tired of being judged, tired of holding herself to rules written by people who would never know her name. There were moments when she let herself feel alone, at night, in the barn, in the fields. She would close her eyes and breathe deeply, and for a few seconds, she was not a sinner, not a wife, not a mother, not a servant, just a person, alive. She knew other women felt it too. The weariness, the pressure, the quiet resistance that lived inside even the most obedient among them. It passed between them in glances, in half sentences, and shared silences. They didn't need to say it aloud. They all knew. The church spoke of virtue as something pure, untouched, but they knew that virtue was dirty work. It was cleaning up after others. It was feeding those who never said thank you. It was putting your own feelings second, third, last. It was waking up in the night and not telling anyone you hadn't slept. It was putting yourself aside so many times that you sometimes forgot who you had been before. They were praised when they endured, but never when they spoke out. Never when they asked for more. Never when they said no. That was not virtue. That was rebellion. And rebellion, even in thought, was sin. So she asked for forgiveness more often than she asked for help. And she prayed, not always to be good, sometimes just to be seen, sometimes just to be heard by someone, even in silence, sometimes just to know she was more than what the world said she could be. In private, she wondered what virtue meant when it hurt this much. Was it really holy to give so much that there was nothing left? Was it good to keep others warm while she was cold? Was it right to never speak her truth? She never said these things aloud, but she carried them in the quiet curve of her back, in the tightness of her jaw, in the softness she gave others, even when no softness was returned. And still, she continued, not because she loved the rules, but because she loved what she protected. Her children, her sisters, her home, her quiet place by the window, her single candle, her whispered prayer. Because even though the rules were heavy, she found light in what she gave, not in the judgment of others, but in her own still strength. She did not need their permission to be good. She already was. Women and the law, no voice, no choice. She lived under laws she did not write, rules carved by hands that never asked her name. Her life was circled by permissions, not rights. What she could do, what she could not, what she must ask for, what she could never expect. The law did not speak her language. It spoke in the names of fathers, husbands, kings, priests. It spoke around her, over her, never to her. From the moment she was born, her position was fixed, not just in society, but in law. She was someone's daughter, later, someone's wife, eventually, someone's mother, but never her own person in the eyes of the law. She could not own property without permission. She could not make contracts alone. She could not bring a case to court unless it was about her own violation. And even then, she needed a man to speak for her. Her body was not protected. It was managed. If she was attacked, she had to prove she resisted. If she could not scream, for fear, for shock, for shame, it was not considered true. If she was raped by her husband, it was not called a crime. Marriage, the law said, implied consent that could never be withdrawn. Her silence was taken as agreement, her pain as expected. If she fought back, she was dangerous. If she cried out too loudly, she was mad. If she accused a man of power, she was a liar. And if the community sided with him, as they often did, she was punished twice, first by the violence, then by the disbelief. She could not divorce, not easily, not without scandal, or ruin, or exile. The church made sure of that. A man could send his wife away if she was unfaithful, infertile, or inconvenient. But a woman had no such path. If her husband was cruel, she was told to pray. If he was drunk, she was told to wait. If he disappeared, she was left with no support, no answers, no recourse. And yet the law demanded her obedience. If she ran away, she could be arrested. If she disobeyed, she could be beaten, and the law would turn its face. A man was allowed to discipline his wife, to restrain her, to punish her. As long as he didn't kill her, it was considered a domestic matter, a private affair, not the law's concern. She knew other women this had happened to, a neighbor who vanished, a sister who stayed, her bruises hidden under sleeves, a mother who never spoke above a whisper. These were not stories. They were warnings, passed down like recipes. Do not argue. Do not provoke. Do not hope too loudly. She learned the edges of her safety. How to speak without offense. How to move through a room without drawing attention. How to lower her eyes just enough to be left alone. She could be accused of things without evidence. Gossip was enough. If someone said she practiced witchcraft, or knew too much about herbs, or spoke too freely, she could be summoned, questioned, searched. If her answers were not pleasing, she could be punished. If her body bore marks, a mole, a birthmark, a scar, they might be taken as signs of sin, and once accused, she was never truly safe again. She could not testify against a man unless he allowed it. She could not choose who she married. Her father did that, or her brother, or the lord of the land. And once married, she was expected to obey, forever. Even widows, freer than wives, had limited control. They might manage land, but not without challenge. They might run a shop, but always under scrutiny. They might live alone, but never in peace. Freedom came with suspicion. A woman who lived alone was asked questions. She was watched. Her actions weighed. There were a few who found protection. Noble women, wealthy widows, cloistered nuns. They had papers, titles, power through proximity. But most women lived in silence, in lawlessness, wrapped in law. She could be punished for adultery, for theft, for speech, for presence. She could be executed for what men might be forgiven, and she could not write her defense. Because most women were not taught to write at all. Still, she learned how to survive within these walls. She learned how to negotiate without speaking, how to ask for what she needed without offending pride, how to make decisions that appeared to be someone else's idea. She became fluent in unspoken language, in lowered glances, in strategic silences. She became a lawyer of gesture, a judge of emotion, a keeper of peace, not because the law protected her, but because it did not. She carved out space where she could, in kitchens, in markets, in gardens, in whispers with other women. She knew the law would not come to save her, so she saved herself. Through care, through planning, through community. She helped other women when they were hurt. She hid them when they needed escape. She passed warnings. She shared food. She told them which priest to trust, which midwife to call, which neighbor to avoid. Her justice was not written in parchment. It was passed hand to hand. Her laws were not in Latin. They were in the way she held a crying child, the way she mended a neighbor's clothes, the way she sat beside a sickbed without being asked. She made order in a world that offered her none. And though her name appears in no court records, no legal books, no royal decrees, her life was filled with choices, difficult, dangerous, often invisible. And in those choices, there was courage. Because to live without rights is not the same as living without power. Her voice was not welcome in court, so she made her life a testimony instead, white and black, noble and poor women compared. Not all women lived the same life. Some wore linen, others wore wool. Some walked through marble halls. Others walked barefoot through mud. Some were served, others served. Some were cloaked in silence and satin, others in noise and dirt. But all were women, and all were bound by different chains. The noble woman woke in a bed, not straw, but feathers, not alone, but surrounded by attendants. The fire was already lit, water warmed, clothes laid out. She was dressed, combed, fed. Her days began in stillness, in cool stone rooms, with time to pray, time to breathe. The peasant woman woke on the floor, or on a rough wooden frame with a thin layer of straw. Her children stirred beside her. The fire had died. The air was cold. Her feet touched frozen ground. No one waited to serve her. She lit the fire. She fetched the water. She baked the bread. She worked before the sun rose. The noblewoman's hands were soft, her nails clean. Her time was filled with sewing, with music, with prayer, with long walks in walled gardens. She practiced the lute. She read, if she had been taught. She embroidered delicate flowers onto fine cloth. Her fingers never bled from rope or stone. The peasant woman's hands were thick with callus, cracked from water, burned from pots. Her time was filled with survival, kneading dough, mending boots, carrying pails, hauling grain, feeding chickens, scrubbing benches. Her fingers bent with strain. Her palms were red from the years of toil. The noblewoman's marriage was arranged, but so was the peasant's. Neither chose freely. Both were bartered. One for land, one for livestock, one for titles, one for bread. Both were told this was their duty, their fate, their honor. The noblewoman was guarded, watched, controlled by fathers, uncles, stewards. She could not leave the castle without escort. She could not speak freely. Her life was wrapped in protocol, but also in velvet, in safety. She rarely went hungry. She rarely feared the cold. She had moments of comfort. The peasant woman was not guarded. She was exposed to the elements, to hunger, to danger. She walked to the fields alone. She worked under sun and storm. She feared for her children, for her animals, for her crop. She knew the sharp edge of winter, the sudden pain of a bad harvest. But both lived under rules they did not make. The noblewoman had beauty used against her. She was displayed like art, expected to be graceful, quiet, poised. Her body belonged to politics. Her fertility was discussed in rooms where she was not invited. Her life was a symbol, a bridge between families. She smiled when told, sat when asked, concealed her true thoughts behind embroidery and posture. The peasant woman had strength used against her. She was expected to endure, to give, to carry, to feed, to heal. Her body was not poetry. It was a tool, a vessel, a field for work and birth. She was not praised for grace, but for usefulness, for how long she lasted, for how much she could bear. The noblewoman knew silence, a different kind, not from exhaustion, but from isolation. There were moments when she stood on balconies, looked down at the world, and wondered what it would feel like to walk among it freely. She saw the village, but never entered. She smelled the bread, but never baked it. She lived in a gilded cage, beautiful, but locked. The peasant woman knew silence too, not from stillness, but from suppression. She had no space to speak. Her words were buried beneath labor, beneath the noise of the market, the clatter of pots, the cries of children. Her voice was small, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one asked. And still, they both dreamed. The noblewoman dreamed of freedom, to choose her life, to learn, to travel, to step out of the roles drawn for her. The peasant woman dreamed of rest, of warmth, of full bellies, of shoes for every child, of time to sit without guilt. Sometimes their lives touched. At church, at the market, during births and deaths, during feasts and famines. And in those moments, they saw each other, across distance, across class, across the silence that separated them. Sometimes they envied one another. The noblewoman saw the peasant woman's closeness to life, her children always near, her freedom to move, her laughter without court manners. The peasant woman saw the noblewoman's safety, her clean clothes, her quiet meals, her warm rooms, but neither wanted to trade fully, because both knew their burdens deeply. The noblewoman's education, if she had one, was limited, enough to read the Bible, enough to write a letter, but not to argue, not to lead. If she wrote too much, she was odd. If she asked too many questions, she was dangerous. Books were for monks, not for wives. The peasant woman often could not read at all. Her learning came through doing, through watching, through memory, through stories passed by mouth, not by ink. And yet, both women were wise. They knew how to run a household, how to keep food from spoiling, how to heal a cough with herbs, how to sense danger, how to comfort a child, how to manage a man's pride, how to hide their own pain. They were clever in different ways, strategic, observant, resilient. One wore jewelry, one wore mud, one gave orders, one gave everything. And still, they were more alike than they appeared, because neither truly owned her life. Both were praised for what they gave away, their bodies, their time, their obedience, their silence. And both were forgotten when their usefulness faded. One was buried with stone, the other without. But the world they left behind bore their shape, their work, their strength, their sacrifice. Different in class, but united in cost. Women in towns, trade, craft, and boundaries. The town was louder than the village, Cobblestones echoed with carts and hooves. Voices rose and fell in the market. Smoke curled from chimneys into the narrow sky. Walls held the noise inside, and inside those walls, women worked. Not just in homes, but in shops, in stalls, behind counters, over vats, at looms. Town life made space for more hands, but not always more freedom. A town woman rose early, not with bird song, but with the sounds of shutters opening, firewood splitting, and neighbors stirring. Her home was smaller, closer to others. One room, two if lucky. She swept the stoop, drew water from a public well, lit the oven if the baker's fire was out, and then she began her work, not only for her family, but for trade. Because in towns, work could be sold. She might be a brewer, boiling hops, stirring malt, tasting for bitterness, pouring into barrels, selling to travelers and townsfolk. Ale was a woman's business until it grew too profitable, and then men took it. She might be a midwife, the one who was called in the night, who knew herbs and blood, who whispered calm and caught life with bare hands. Midwives were needed, respected, and feared. If a birth went wrong, suspicion followed. She might be a weaver, sitting at a loom from dawn to dusk, feet and fingers in rhythm, spinning thread into cloth, sometimes fine, sometimes rough. She might work for a guild or outside one, always on the edge. Some women kept shops, selling ribbons, candles, buttons, cheese. Others worked inside them. Wives of cobblers, bakers, blacksmiths, not named on the sign, but present in every transaction. They kept the ledgers, cleaned the tools, managed the orders. When the husband died, the wife often kept it going, quietly, capably, until a man claimed it again. Daughters learned by watching, stirring pots, sweeping ash, running errands, wrapping bread in cloth. The shop was school, the market was their world. But even in town, where coins changed hands, women's labor was called help. Not trade, not profession. She was a good wife, not a merchant. Her skill was natural, expected, not paid as a craft. The law did not shield her. A man could take her space, her tools, her goods. If she complained, she risked more. Respectable women did not argue in public. They did not raise their voice over coin, and still she bargained. Fiercely, politely, strategically. She learned how to price a pot, how to weigh a cut of meat, how to nod just enough to close the sale. Her face became known. Her reputation mattered. If she gave fair measure, she was trusted. If not, she was watched. The guilds were powerful, but closed. Most were for men. Some allowed widows if their husbands had belonged. Fewer still allowed women in their own right. Basket makers, silk spinners, brewers, but always with limits. She might work for a guild, but rarely lead one. She might master a craft, but never be called a master. Still, she found ways to build. A stall in the market square, a table by the bridge, a window with ribbons hanging, a name passed by word of mouth. Go to her, she makes the best soap. That name was her pride, more than a title. It was proof. And her world was larger than it seemed. She knew the other women, the spinner 2 doors down, the baker's wife with the quick smile, the old widow who knew every street and every child's name. Together, they formed a quiet network, sharing news, trading favors, warning one another when trouble came. She moved through the town with purpose. She knew when to be invisible and when to be seen. She dressed modestly, but neatly. She spoke carefully, but firmly. Her feet walked the same stones every day, and each step was learned. She knew the dangers, too. A woman alone at night could be questioned, watched, followed. If a man harassed her, she had little recourse. If a crime occurred and she was nearby, she might be blamed. Her presence was always evaluated. Some women lived on the edge, widows, spinsters, outsiders. They kept to themselves, worked without protection. If their work was successful, envy followed. If they failed, no one helped. They were closest to suspicion, closest to being called witch, liar, thief. And yet, many chose town life, because here, at least, there was opportunity to earn, to build, to learn. A peasant woman might never see coin. A town woman handled it daily. She touched trade, tasted independence, even in slivers. She watched as power shifted slowly, as daughters ran shops while their brothers drank, as widows managed debts better than their late husbands, as young women began to read, write, think, not many, but some. She might not change the law, but she learned how to live near its edges, how to claim space without drawing fire, how to grow quietly behind the scenes. She knew the rhythm of the bells, the gossip of the street, the names of every merchant and every gatekeeper. She read people the way others read books. And at night, when the shutters closed and the fire burned low, she counted her day, not in gold, but in what she kept, what she held, what she made, what she endured. In towns, there was noise, but within that noise, she made a life. Small, but hers, the witch and the nun. Opposites in one age. In the same century, in the same lands, under the same sky. Two women walked very different paths. One wore black robes, knelt before a crucifix, and spoke only when allowed. The other wore earth-colored cloth, walked barefoot, and spoke when she shouldn't. One was called holy. The other was called cursed. But sometimes, they were not so different at all. The nun lived in stone, behind thick walls, within an order of silence and discipline. Her days followed bells, prayer, work, meals, more prayer. She woke before the sun. She spoke only when it served devotion. Her world was narrow, but protected. She belonged to God, and so she was safe, or safer than most. The witch lived in the margins, on the edge of a village, in a forest hut, or among the people, but slightly apart. She had no bells to guide her day. She worked by firelight, by instinct. She belonged to no one, and so she was feared. But both women knew the body. They knew herbs, pain, birth, blood. Both were called when others were desperate. Both offered care that men could not give. Both listened more than they spoke, and both were misunderstood. The nun took vows, poverty, chastity, obedience. She renounced the world, or was placed there by it. Some women chose the convent, others were sent. Unwanted daughters, dowryless girls, widows with nowhere else to go. The church called it a gift to God, but often it was exile in holy form. Inside, she found purpose, or not. Some found peace in the order. A life without men, without childbirth, without hunger. A life with books, with music, with ritual. Others felt caged, longed for the earth, for laughter, for a voice of their own. The witch took no vows. She was not given rules. She made her own. She helped with coughs, fevers, infertility. She knew how to ease pain, how to bind wounds, how to calm a mother in labor. Some called her wise, others whispered. She was tolerated until she wasn't. A child died, a cow went dry, a man fell sick. Suddenly, fingers pointed. Suspicion bloomed quickly, and fear gave it roots. The same hand she healed now turned against her. The nun and the witch both lived outside normal life. Both were apart. One respected, the other reviled. But their power, however slight, came from the same source: knowledge. And the world did not love women who knew too much. The nun was guarded. Her texts were censored, her letters reviewed. If she wrote poetry, it was checked. If she had visions, they were judged by priests. Her holiness was conditional, fragile. She had to prove it constantly. The witch had no one to protect her. Her words were her own. Her risk, too. She was called witch for many reasons. For being old, for being unmarried, for surviving when others didn't, for living without a man, or simply for being inconvenient. And sometimes, the nun was called witch, too. A rumor, a misstep, a woman too clever, a woman who disobeyed. One wore a veil, the other a scarf. One lived among saints, the other among suspicion. But both were women trying to live in a world not built for them. One gave herself to heaven, the other to the earth. Both were punished when they strayed from the narrow line between silence and usefulness. Some nuns wrote. Their words survive. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, women who dared to write theology, music, visions. They were rare, watched closely, allowed only because their words were wrapped in faith. The witches left no books, only stories. Many lost, others twisted. We do not know their names, only their endings. They were burned, drowned, shamed, banished, forgotten. The nun was buried in a habit, the witch in unmarked ground. But both once held the hands of the dying. Both once whispered comfort into darkness. Both once stood at the edge of pain and tried to ease it. And both were erased in different ways. One with reverence, the other with fire. And yet, we remember. Not clearly, not perfectly, but enough. We remember the healer with ash-streaked hands, the nun who wrote by candlelight, the woman who stood between life and death and did not look away. We remember them not as opposites, but as echoes. Two faces of the same courage. One sanctioned, one hunted, both real. Loss and widowhood. Freedom or decline. She stood alone, not because she chose it, but because it happened. Her husband was gone, buried under earth, or taken by plague, by war, by time. His absence filled the house louder than his presence ever had. His chair sat empty, his tools untouched. And in the silence, something strange began to grow, both fear and space. Widowhood was not one thing. It was many. A door that opened, a wall that fell, a chain that broke or tightened. Some women wept, not because they loved their husbands, but because they had no idea how to survive without them. The law recognized the man. The property followed the man. The coin, the house, the animals, none were hers. She had lived in the space between ownership and obligation. Now, with no one above her, the ground fell open beneath her. For others, widowhood was the first breath after years of holding it in. No more hands at her throat. No more orders barked before breakfast. No more waiting at the window to see if he came home angry. No more bruises to hide. No more silence to swallow. She was alone now, and alone meant safe. Sometimes, the community showed pity, left baskets of bread, helped fix a fence, but pity faded quickly. A woman without a husband was seen as incomplete, unanchored, unsettling, especially if she had no sons, especially if she smiled too easily, dressed too neatly, laughed too freely. Widowhood gave her choices, but not without price. If she had children, they came first. She must protect them, feed them, raise them without showing fear. She might remarry, not for love, but for shelter, for help in the fields, for a roof in winter. The second husband was often older, often chosen quickly, often no better. If she stayed single, she lived on edges. She could manage her late husband's business, but only temporarily. She could hold land, but only until a male heir came of age. She could speak at market, but was always watched. If she succeeded, some whispered. If she failed, no one helped. Some widows moved in with family, a brother, a grown son, a nephew. But even there, she was a guest in a world that used to be hers. She learned to hold her tongue, to keep small, to ask before spending her own coin. Others lived alone, in small cottages, at the end of lanes, in silence broken only by birds, wind, and memory. Some grew herbs, wove cloth, watched the seasons, prayed often. They were called quiet, or strange, or dangerous. The line between wise woman and witch was thin, and widows walked it every day. A young widow was the most watched. If she was pretty, men stared. If she was wealthy, they schemed. If she was neither, they ignored her. But no matter her age, her name was changed. Not to Miss, not to Madame, just widow. As if that word swallowed all others. Some found power in it. They managed estates, commissioned prayers for their late husbands, donated to churches, kept accounts, paid servants, sat at the head of tables they once served at. These were rare, mostly noble. but even they knew it could be taken from them. One wrong step, one rumor, one rival, and everything shifted. Still, widowhood gave something most women never had: time. Time to think, to remember who they had been before marriage, to mourn not only a man, but a self they had forgotten. Time to feel without being watched, to cry in the middle of the day, to sit still in sunlight without apology. Some wrote, some stitched their names into linens, some planted trees, some lit candles every morning and spoke to no one but the dead. Some felt guilt for feeling peace. Others felt grief they never expected, not because they loved him, but because they had never been given space to know if they did. Loss was not simple. It came in waves, in shadows, in the way the house breathed differently, in the absence of footsteps, in the quiet after the evening meal, in the single cup on the table. And yet, in that space, she sometimes found herself again, not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly, in the way she arranged her tools, in the stories she began telling her children, in the way she allowed herself to rest when the work was done, in the sound of her own breath, uninterrupted. She was still not free, but she was no longer tethered to someone else's breath, command, or judgment. She began to walk differently, slower, straighter. She looked at the world with new eyes, still cautious, but less afraid. She was not young, but she was not finished. The church told her to be modest. The law told her to be patient. Her neighbors told her to be careful. But the wind through her open window told her something else. You are still here, and still yours. Motherhood, love, loss, and labor. It began with hope, then with sickness, nausea in the morning, a heaviness in the limbs. The world narrowed, became slower, more careful. She felt change before it showed, in her breath, in her sleep, in the way her body no longer belonged entirely to her. Pregnancy was not a joy without shadow. It was risk. It was weight. It was waiting. She knew stories of women who bled too soon, who labored for days, who never woke again. And yet, each time, she hoped. She worked through it. There was no rest. Fields still needed tending. Bread still needed baking. Children still needed feeding. She bent and carried and stirred and swept with life growing inside her. When labor came, it came in pain. There were no hospitals, no clean beds, no quiet halls. She gave birth on straw, on wooden benches, on cold stone floors, sometimes alone, sometimes with a midwife, always with risk. She screamed, or she didn't. She tore, or she bled, or she held her breath and prayed it would end before she broke. And then came silence, followed sometimes by a cry. A child, small, wet, alive. She counted fingers, toes, waited for color to return to the lips, waited for breath to come steadily. She was told not to love it too quickly, to wait a few days, to see if it lived. But she loved it already. She fed the baby with her body, rocked it with aching arms, slept in moments, not hours. Her life became divided into needs, not hers, but theirs. The baby cried. She answered. The baby slept. She watched. The baby smiled. And for a moment, the world was good. She became mother, not just by blood, but by labor, by waking, by giving, again and again. And sometimes the child died. They often did. Fever, cough, hunger, winter, one night too cold, one breath too shallow, one illness no one could name. She wrapped the body in cloth, dug the hole herself, or stood beside it. She wept, if she could, or didn't, because the grief was too deep. And then she cooked again, cleaned again, nursed another child. Her grief became muscle memory, folded into the rhythm of her days. She never forgot, but she had no time to remember. A mother's love was not gentle. It was fierce. It was desperate. It was stitched into the clothes, the meals, the long hours. It was the way she sat awake in the dark, listening for breath. It was the way she never took peace for granted. She knew her children were not hers to keep. They belonged to fate, to illness, to war, to marriage, to the church. She raised daughters who would be given away, sons who would be taken to serve lords or kings. She poured herself into them anyway. She taught them how to walk, how to work, how to pray, how to listen, how to survive. She prepared them for a world that would not be kind. Some days, she was praised. What a good mother. But most days, she was invisible. Her work was not counted. Her exhaustion not named. Her sacrifices expected. And yet, she continued. Because love, once begun, could not be stopped. She gave even when she had nothing left. She held them even when her arms trembled. She smiled even when the world gave her no reason to. She whispered lullabies passed down through generations. Ancient words, gentle songs. Promises she could not guarantee, but gave anyway. You are safe. You are loved. You are mine. And as they grew, she let them go. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The first time they walked without her. The first time they didn't cry when she left the room. The first time they asked questions she could not answer. She grew smaller in their eyes, even as they grew larger in hers. Some came back. Some didn't. Some became mothers themselves, and only then understood. She aged with their names on her lips. Sometimes she saw their faces in dreams, the ones still with her, and the ones she had lost. And in those quiet hours before dawn, she remembered all of them. Not as they were in death, not as they were in distance, but as they had once been, sleeping against her chest, warm, alive, her world. Motherhood did not ask for her opinion. It took her, remade her, and gave her back to herself, changed. She bore the scars, the sag of her belly, the curve of her back, the lines around her eyes, but also the strength, the patience, the fire. She was no longer the girl she had been. She was more, and though no monument would be built in her name, though no book would carry her story, though the law saw her only in relation to men, Her children carried her forward. In their skin, in their voice, in the way they carried the weight she once held for them. She was never just a mother. She was history given breath, women and work, the invisible backbone. She worked before she could name it, before anyone told her it was labor, before anyone thanked her. She worked because it needed to be done, because the sun rose, and so did she, because mouths opened and someone had to fill them, because floors grew dusty and clothes wore thin, and time did not wait. She rose in the dark, rubbed her eyes with stiff fingers, lit the fire, carried the water, kneaded the dough, milked the goats. Her work began before the village stirred and ended after the stars had already claimed the sky. She was not paid, not in coin, not in silver. Her reward was the silence of complaint, a clean floor, a full belly, a fire that did not go out. Her labor was not counted, not in records, not in guilds, not in tax rolls. But without her, everything would collapse. She worked in fields, side by side with men, planting, weeding, harvesting. She lifted the same weight, breathed the same dust, felt the same ache in her spine, but at day's end, her hands also made the food, tended the children, spun the thread, prayed for those who did less and slept more. In cities, she ran stalls, sold eggs, thread, herbs, candle stubs. She mended clothes, took in laundry, helped her husband shop, then kept it running when he drank too much or died too early. She brewed ale until men decided ale-making should be theirs. She baked bread until a guild denied her ovens. She was not allowed into most halls, most meetings, most titles. But still, she found a way to move through them, not with noise, but with persistence, with routine, with presence. She made wool into yarn, yarn into cloth, cloth into dresses. Each stitch a mark of time, of effort, of care. She walked miles each day, not in journey, but in repetition, from hearth to garden, from barn to well, from cradle to firewood pile, from church to home with a child on her hip and a basket on her back. She was not praised for this. Praise was for saints and soldiers, but she was always needed, always called, always expected. She remembered the first time she lifted a heavy pot, the way her arms trembled, the splash of heat, and then the silence. No one noticed. So she kept going. She remembered the first time she cleaned someone else's mess and was blamed for doing it too slowly. She remembered the first time her back gave out in the middle of a task and no one said stop. They only asked when it would be done. Her name was not on deeds, but she knew the shape of the land. She knew which rows grew fastest, which corners caught the morning light, which paths stayed muddy longest. Her knowledge was lived, not taught. She watched the seasons, the sky, the animals, the signs of sickness, the feel of flower, the weight of water. She knew a good egg by sound, a spoiled jar by smell, a lie by silence. She taught others, not with books, but with hands. She placed a child's fingers on the right knot, guided their grip on the spindle, showed them how to fold a sheet so it fit the chest just so. She passed on wisdom, not because it was hers, but because someone once passed it to her. Her work was not a task, It was a rhythm, a breath, a heartbeat of the home. And when she became old, her labor did not end. It only changed. She was the one who remembered where the herbs grew best, which neighbor could be trusted, how to stretch the stew on a lean week, how to soothe a frightened child when the wind howled like wolves. She worked with stories, with songs, with steady hands that no longer moved as fast, but still knew exactly where to press when a fever came. She had been a girl who worked, then a wife who worked, then a mother who worked. And when she died, her hands were still busy in memory. They said she was quiet, but her hands told a louder story. They said she did little, but the absence she left was vast, because her work was never just for herself. It was the work of continuation, of making, of mending, of feeding, of holding. She was not the pillar of history. She was the foundation beneath it. Illness and the body, pain without remedy. She knew her body as a vessel of labor, of birth, of silence. She also knew it as a source of suffering, not once in a while, but often, quietly, without medicine, without answer, without relief. Pain came in seasons. With cold winds, it lived in her joints. In summer, it came with fever. At harvest, it came in blisters. In winter, in coughs that rattled deep in the chest. But there was no word for chronic, no name for aching that never left. There was only tired, only weak, and always get up. She worked through it because she had to, because pain did not remove duty, because illness did not stop hunger. No one asked if she could continue. They assumed she would. She bled each month without question, sometimes with pain so sharp she had to sit on the floor, gripping her knees. There was no privacy, no comfort, only rags, water, waiting. When bleeding stopped, too soon or too late, it meant something had changed. Pregnancy, illness, age, or something worse. But she was never told why. She learned by watching others, who grew pale, who stopped walking, who died. If her belly swelled and then emptied too early, they said it was God's will, or punishment, or mystery. But she carried the ache alone, the weight of loss, the shame of not understanding. She feared fevers. They came fast, took breath, color, strength. Sometimes they passed, sometimes they stayed. She sat beside others who burned, whispered prayers, laid cloths on hot skin, and watched the light fade from their eyes. She wondered when it would be her. There were healers, women with herbs, midwives, widows who knew old remedies. But even they could only soften pain, not erase it. A tea for cramping, a paste for burns, smoke for fever, hope for the rest. The church offered prayers, holy relics, confession, pilgrimage, but not understanding. Suffering, they said, was holy. It brought her closer to God, closer to saints, closer to Mary. They called it sacred. She called it endless. Some men were treated, some rich women too, but she waited, always last, always after others. She whispered her symptoms only when needed. She smiled when it hurt. She moved slowly, carefully, pretending she was fine. until she wasn't. If she lost her hearing, her world grew smaller. If she lost her sight, she was no longer useful. If she lost her strength, she was a burden. And if her mind began to wander, they called her cursed, or possessed, or broken. No one checked her heart, her lungs, her dreams. They saw what she'd done, not how she felt. And so, her body became a quiet battlefield. She bore wounds with no name, pains with no cure, exhaustion that sleep never healed. Sometimes she felt herself unraveling, but she said nothing, because saying something changed nothing. She remembered when she was young, how quickly her body obeyed, how it bent and carried and leapt. And she remembered the first time it failed her, a fall, a fever, a pregnancy too close to the last. From that point on, she moved with more caution. She knew other women who bled too long, who shook without cause, who collapsed, who cried out in sleep, and she knew the silence around them, the way others looked away, as if pain was shameful, as if it should be hidden. But she knew pain did not mean weakness. It meant she was alive, still walking, still working, still here. She learned to measure her days not by hours, but by how much she could endure. Some mornings she lifted the bucket. Other mornings she stared at it and waited until her arms answered. She aged, and the pain changed, moved, deepened. Her knees no longer bent, her back curved, her breath shortened, but her memory stayed, her will steady. Sometimes she whispered to her own body, just one more day, just one more winter. Just let me see my daughter's child. And her body, broken and brilliant, listened. It carried her farther than she ever thought it would. She was never thanked for surviving, but she did. The voice of silence. How women wrote history. She did not write history in books. Her name was not carved into stone. She did not lead armies, did not wear crowns, did not speak from thrones or pulpits, but still, she left traces, in cloth, in story, in the slow, steady work of living. She left them where no one thought to look. She was there when kingdoms rose and fell, not at the center, but in the shadows, stirring soup while armies marched, sewing while treaties were made, cradling children while men claimed glory. She was not absent. She was simply unrecorded. History remembered kings, but forgot the hands that washed their clothes. It praised saints, but not the mothers who birthed them. It told tales of war, but not of the women who rebuilt after fire. She told stories to her daughters, of winters survived, of births witnessed, of women who escaped, who endured, who defied without being seen. These stories never reached parchment, but they passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. That was her archive, not a library, but a lineage. Some women did write, in convents, in corners, in secret. They wrote prayers, visions, letters. They wrote what they saw, what they felt, what they feared. They signed their names if they were brave, or left no name at all. A few are remembered: Christine de Pizan, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, but most remain unknown. Their words lost, burned, buried, or simply unread. Still, Their ink remains on faded vellum. Their voices whisper beneath the weight of time. And others, who could not write, marked their presence differently. In weaving patterns, in bread recipes, in healing knowledge, in lullabies, in carefully folded cloth stored in wooden chests, in whispered advice to a new bride. In the way they taught children to speak, to pray, to hope. Each gesture was a sentence, each sacrifice a paragraph, each act of survival a page in a book no one thought to read. They left behind graves without names, bones without dates, but also households that kept standing, fields that kept yielding, children who kept walking forward. That, too, was history. She knew she would not be remembered by historians, but she hoped to be remembered by hands, by the ones who cooked her recipes, sang her songs, wore the shawls she mended, told the jokes she told, used the remedies she made from bitter herbs and gentle roots. She did not care for statues. She cared for warmth, for continuity, for keeping something alive. She did not ask for fame, only that someone someday would say, she was here, she mattered. And now, centuries later, we try to say it. We read between the lines, between the laws, between the church records and the noble deeds. We look for the thumbprints pressed into bread, for the threads that held communities together, for the names whispered in stories that survived fire, famine, forgetting. We try to see her, not as shadow, but as foundation, not as silence, but as strength, not as background, but as author, of children, of households, of lifetimes. She did not write history the way men did, but she wrote it all the same, in the language of survival, closing words, a soft memory of a hard life. She does not speak anymore, not because she never had words, but because time has carried them away. And yet, if we listen carefully, in the quiet, in the dark, in the breath between one thought and the next, we can still feel her, not as a name, but as a presence, not as a queen or a saint or a legend, but as a woman, ordinary, invisible, enduring. Her life was not easy, not grand, not fair. She did not choose most of what happened to her, but she moved through it with grace of another kind. Not the grace of beauty, but the grace of survival, the grace of continuing. The world gave her little, no power, no voice, no safety. It expected her to give, and give she did. Her strength, her time, her silence, her body, her hope. She gave without glory, and still she remained. She suffered, and was not seen. She labored, and was not named. She built lives, and was not remembered. But here, in this quiet hour, we remember her. Not with trumpets, not with stone, but with stillness. We remember the girl who rose before dawn, and the woman who waited for her husband's return, the mother who buried a child and fed another, the healer who whispered through illness, the widow who lit a fire just for herself, the wife who folded her hands and said nothing when everything hurt. We remember the ones who did not scream, but endured. They lived in a world that told them their worth was small, but they made that world run. They were not history's subjects. They were its breath. And maybe, just maybe, when we lie down now in our warm rooms, under soft blankets, behind locked doors, we can thank them, silently, gently, for carrying us here. They were not weak, they were tired, and they kept going. Rest now. History remembers. We remember. You are not alone.